Welcome to Construction Mastery. Let's have a look at some different types of bonds that may be provided, and you guys may be familiar with many of them. You've got performance bonds, retention bonds, materials, off-site bonds, advance payment bonds, tender bonds, and even payment bonds. We're going to have a look through some of these types of bonds, the most popular being the performance bond. And the performance bond is commonly used in the construction industry as a means of insuring a client against the risk of a contractor failing to fulfill contractual obligations to the client. The most common concern relates to a contractor becoming insolvent before completing the contract. Performance bonds are typically set at 10% of the contract value, and this compensation can enable the client to overcome difficulties that have been caused by non-performance of the contractor, such as, for example, finding a new contractor to complete the works. And that's what the 10% could be used for. Amazing. Let's have a look at what performance bonds are required to do. So performance bonds are required to guarantee the satisfactory performance of one party's contractual obligations. Performance bonds ensure the guarantor pays for the loss up to the value of the bond. Performance bonds are also required and normally activated upon insolvency or if the retention fund is not sufficient for making good defects. Oh, and just as an interesting note, the standard value of a performance bond is 10% of the contract value, which is the premium for taking out the bond and is added to the contract sum. So to simplify, the contractor would normally add 10% onto his tender costs to cover the cost of the bond. Secondly, we've got tender bonds or bid bonds. And bid bonds are rare in the UK, but can be a requirement of an international tender process. And they are usually on-demand bonds submitted with a tender to secure the tenderer's commitment to commence the contract. Commitment to commence the contract. That was a key point. And the bond is partially or fully forfeited if the winning tenderer fails to execute the contract or meet other specified conditions. Bid bonds can be open to abuse by the client and may prevent smaller companies from tendering. But one of the key advantages to bid bonds are that they essentially cover the employer if the lowest tenderer refuses to enter into a contract with them. It should also prevent idle tendering and is an incentive to put in a serious price. And the standard value of a tender bond, or known as a bid bond, is 1 to 5% of the tender sum. And remember that performance bonds are around 10% of the tender sum. Thirdly, we have materials off-site bonds and advanced payment bonds. And this bond provides some security to an employer who pays for materials that are kept elsewhere before delivered to site. They are used where a contractor has a high mobilization cost and are used for security against the advance payment. This is similar to the situation where an advance payment is made in that a bond secures the payment against default by the contractor and is likely to be an on-demand bond, so not a default bond. We'll have a look at what on-demand bonds are in another video, but just for a little bit of reference, the essential difference between an on-demand bond and a default bond is that under an on-demand bond, the employer does not have to prove default. These type of bonds are rare, and so you can see that an advance payment bond is quite powerful. The bond might be up to the value of the off-site items, with the value of the bond reducing as deliveries are made to site. And an advance payment bond is used if the client agrees to make an advance payment to the contractor, for example, where the contractor has very high significant startup and procurement costs before construction even begins. A bond may be required to secure the payment against default by the contractor. And this will normally be an on-demand bond too. Fourthly, we have a retention bond. And retention, if you didn't know, is a percentage, often about 3 to 5% of the amount certified, which is due to the contractor on an interim certificate that is retained by the client. And the purpose of retention is to ensure the contractor properly completes the activities required of them under the contract. Half of the amount retained is released on the certification of practical completion, and the remainder is released upon certification of making good defects. And that's a key point. Please remember that. An alternative to retention is a retention bond, where the client agrees to pay the amount which would otherwise have been held as retention, but instead a bond is provided to secure the amount that would have been retained. I hope you guys are with me. And as with retention, the value of the bond will usually reduce after practical completion has been certified. So you may be thinking, what is the reason for a retention bond and why not just use normal retention? So retention bonds would normally be used in difficult market conditions to aid the contractor's cash flow. and the retention bond should be of the same value as the retention deducted would have been. And if the contractor does not maintain the retention bond, the employer can deduct retention from interim payments. Let's now check out some of the disadvantages of a retention bond, and there are 4 of them. So number 1, the employer would have to pay the premium for taking out the bond. Disadvantage number 2, retention bonds may reduce the contractor's incentive to complete to standard and to complete promptly. Number 3, it harms the employer's cash flow. And number 4, the employer would not get the interest accruing on the amount of the retention bond. And that wraps up this video. As always, feel free to contact me at hilan@constructionmastery.com. I'm at your service. Speak soon. Thanks, guys.